Hello, and welcome to the Point of View stories for earthquakes. I'm going to tell the same story from the Earthquakes mini-story lesson in a number of different ways. Each time I tell the story, I'll change the time in which the story is being told, or I will change the person who is telling the story. So we'll hear it from a different point of view. Let's start by telling the story as if it is happening right now, or as we say, in the present. Okay. Luke lives in San Francisco. Luke can eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke tells his friend George. George thinks this seems far-fetched. He thinks that Luke is pulling his leg. "You've got to be kidding," he says to Luke. So Luke bets George $100 that he can eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke eats 15 eggs in the first 10 minutes, then all of a sudden, the ground starts to shake. There is an earthquake due east of San Francisco. Luke is not surprised because earthquakes are a dime a dozen in San Francisco. "When you live in San Francisco, it's a given that you will feel an earthquake," Luke says. "Totally," George says. Then Luke eats the rest of the eggs in 22 minutes, so George has to give him $100. Okay, so that ends the story being told as if it is happening right now. Next, let's hear the story as if it happened 7 months ago. 7 months ago, Luke lived in San Francisco. Luke could eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke told his friend George. George thought this seemed far-fetched. He thought that Luke was pulling his leg. "You've got to be kidding," he said to Luke. So Luke bet George $100 that he could eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke ate 15 eggs in the first 15 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, the ground started to shake. There was an earthquake due east of San Francisco. Luke was not surprised because earthquakes are a dime a dozen in San Francisco. "When you live in San Francisco, it's a given that you will feel an earthquake," said Luke. "Totally," said George. Then Luke ate the rest of the eggs in 22 minutes, so George had to give him $100. Okay, so that is the story as if it's happening in the past, or it's already happened. Now let's tell the story as if it is happening in the future. So we think of the story happening, say, 4 years from now. Okay, here we go. In 4 years, Luke's going to be living in San Francisco. Luke will be able to eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke's going to tell his friend George. George will think this seems far-fetched. He'll think that Luke is pulling his leg. "You've got to be kidding," he'll say to Luke. So Luke's going to bet George $100 that he'll be able to eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke's going to eat 15 eggs in the first 10 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, the ground will start to shake. There is going to be an earthquake due east of San Francisco. Luke will not be surprised, because earthquakes are a dime a dozen in San Francisco. "When you live in San Francisco, it's a given that you will feel an earthquake," Luke will say. "Totally," George will say. Then Luke will eat the rest of the eggs in 22 minutes, so George will have to give him $100. Okay, so that's the end of this version of the story. The version in which the story is in the future, where we talk about events that are going to happen or events that will happen. Now, I'd like you to notice that instead of saying something like George will think, we shorten it in normal conversation by saying George'll think. Basically, we combine the words George and will into George'll. This is more like how we would say it using spoken English. But say in a textbook, you would be more likely to see George will instead of seeing George'll. You also probably noticed that when we convert the word can into the future, we usually say is able to. For example, Luke can eat 50 eggs is changed to Luke will be able to eat 50 eggs. Alright, now let's hear the story from Luke's point of view. So this is the story that's going to be told by Luke. Okay, here we go. I used to live in San Francisco. I could eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. I told my friend George. George thought that this seemed far-fetched. He thought that I was pulling his leg. You've got to be kidding, he said to me. So I bet George $100 that I could eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. I ate 15 eggs in the first 10 minutes. Then all of a sudden, the ground started to shake. There was an earthquake due east of San Francisco. I wasn't surprised because earthquakes are a dime a dozen in San Francisco. When you live in San Francisco, it's a given that you will feel an earthquake, I said. Totally, said George. Then I ate the rest of the eggs in 22 minutes, so George had to give me $100. Okay, so that's our last story. Now, please listen to each version again. And then after you listen to a version, try to tell the story to yourself. If you can't do it, it's okay. Just relax, go back, listen to it again, and then make another attempt to tell yourself the story. Remember, you can listen to this every day until you feel comfortable. Okay, that's all for our point of view stories for earthquakes. We'll see you next time.